All of us today. I'm Paul Saunders, the president of the Center for the National Interest. We're very, very pleased to have you with us. We're really thrilled to have this excellent panel, which I'll introduce very briefly in a minute. I found it a little bit surprising, since we all expected to be in the Mount Vernon room, but also very appropriate that we end up in the Hamilton room instead, given today's conversation. So that's an interesting moment, I guess, shall we say. But very, very pleased to have this really outstanding panel moderated by Isaac Stone-Fish, who many may know, a long-time journalist and editor, someone who has lived out in Asia and reported and worked from there. Now the founder and CEO of the consulting firm Strategy Risks. So we're very pleased to have Isaac. I will turn it over to him. He will introduce the two panelists and take it from here.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you to the Center for National Interest for convening this group. This is an on-the-record conversation. Derek and Robert have a lot to say to each other and to us all on this question of China's trajectory, up or down. Thank you for that notification, reminding us all to silence our phones. So, Isaac Stone-Fish, CEO of Strategy Risks, geopolitical risk firm, and very focused on the period that we're in right now in U.S.-China relations. That feels like it's sort of lacking a name. It's not a Cold War. It's not a Cold War. It's not yet a hot war. I describe this as in the pre-war period. How long that period is going to last is anyone's guess. Derek Scissors, longtime, very thoughtful China watcher at the American Enterprise Institute and China Beige Book. Robert Atkinson on my right, president of Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, also very thoughtful on China issues, especially with a lens of tech. I'm going to have Derek kick us off, giving us a broad sense of where China's going. Hint, it's more on the downside. Robert will rebut, discuss with that. We'll have a conversation, and then we'll open it up for questions. So, Derek, over to you.
Thanks, Isaac. I should say at the outset, because people get confused by this and it infuriates me, so hopefully no one of you will. I have been arguing for Chinese stagnation since they failed to pull their monetary stimulus back in 2010. And there were some problems before that too, but that's when stagnation sort of was set up for this decade. That is not a crisis. We can talk about China's financial system. It does not lend itself to a financial crisis, to say the least. There is no jobs crisis. That's misunderstood or exaggerated. So I'll say more about why there's no crisis if you want to. The crisis would come from a problem with Xi Jinping. He dies tomorrow, and now they have a political crisis, which causes an economic crisis. But I am not arguing about China having an economic crisis. If we have Xi being healthy or someone replaces him who is similar to him, we're going to be dealing with China's economic predation and their domestic economic problems for a while. So just to clarify that from the outset. So why do I think China's trajectory, even though there's no crisis, is nonetheless clearly down? I'll divide this up, and I usually talk about innovation here, but I'm going to cede that to Rob when he first starts, and then I'm going to disagree with him, but I will not bring it up. So I'll start with land at the outset. China has on the urban land side, the housing stock is about 120 million people in excess, and the population is shrinking. So they're trying to erase an excess housing supply of about 120 million for about 120 million people while the population is shrinking. On the rural side, they have about 500 million people with average income less than $4,000 annually, and they can't own their land, which is their most valuable asset. If you wanted to compare it to the United States, U.S. crop yields are about twice China's per hectare. It obviously varies by crop. The U.S. has much more arable land. China can't get a sustained boost from urban land anymore. That's gone. It happened in the 90s. It was really important. It's gone. Urban land is now a drag, and you're just talking about how to set the drag out. Do you want it to happen quickly or slowly, and so on. They can get, in fact, a transformation from privatizing rural land. If you wanted to reverse China's trajectory, that's what you should do. It would cause rural and national income to soar. They have shown no interest in it whatsoever, and in fact, they steadfast refuse it. The big problem for the last 10 years has been debt. The U.S. is currently at outstanding credit as a percentage of GDP, which is a measure from the Bank of International Settlements, to the non-financial sector, so it's not intra-financial trading. This is a good overall measure of leverage that you can compare across countries. The U.S. is at 255%. China's at 290. One of the reasons you have all these cries for stimulus in China that the government doesn't listen to is they know they're already over-leveraged. And this all really occurs since 2008, 2009. On the Chinese side, their debt position in 2008 was much better than ours. If you want to use conventional measures, Chinese money stock, broad money stock, is $43 trillion. The U.S. is $21 trillion, even though our stock of wealth is $60 trillion larger than China's. China's money stock is equal to the U.S. plus 2 Japan's. And the U.S. and Japan have not been, exactly restrained in their monetary policy. The trend in credit is terrible. China is at best where Japan was in 1997. That didn't go very well on the Japanese side, and they're already there. So the debt side for China is quite bad. Now, the big problem, of course, and I only have 5 minutes, so I'm being very superficial about all this. The big problem, of course, is demography. Current U.S. median age is 38. Current Chinese median age is 39. But China will hit 50 in median age in the next 20 years. So it will age 11 years in median age in the next 20 years. And the U.S. will age 5 years. Okay, so we're, what's the difference between 38 and 39? Some people might say the difference between 39 and 40 is very large, but the difference between 38 and 39 is not. However, the age it's going to get worse and worse. Current labor force, ratio of labor force to number of retirees, the U.S. is at 3.37 to 1, and we think we have an aging problem. China's at 2.47 to 1. They have about 2.5 workers per retiree. We're at about 3 1/3, and it's going to get worse on the Chinese side. The phase-in of the mandatory retirement age, as currently announced by China, is way too slow. And finally, the big one. We're arguing about when China's population is going to drop by 100 million, when it's going to drop by 400 million, when it's going to drop by 600 million. All the projections, including very conservative projections, all say this is going to happen. It's just a question of how fast. And it's really hard to be global economic leader if your country is emptying out the way China is. So the long term, when we argue about China's downward trajectory, to me, there is no argument about that there's a downward trajectory. There's an argument about when it becomes seriously down. Has it already happened? Is it in the next 5 years? Is it 20 years from now? I don't think we're going to be looking in 2035 and thinking China's collapsed. I don't think that at all. But the trajectory is down, and the trajectory is down because there's going to be an unprecedented peacetime emptying out of China. Demographically, they have serious debt problems and they won't take the step necessary to correct their land problems. So, the usual response to this, which is a good one, is, are they all stupid? Why don't they do anything about this? And the answer is, no, they're not all stupid, and they are doing something about it. And it actually, I think I'm setting Rob up here in a good way. So, Xi Jinping is playing offense and defense economically. He does not want any sharp turns. Anyone who follows China knows that party's aversion to stability. He's just kind of indifferent to wealth creation. So China's GDP has been rising in the COVID era, 2020 to now. Wealth has been declining as far as we can tell, but I don't know that he cares about wealth declining. Official job creation barely changes with GDP growth. It barely slowed in 2020. It barely picked up in 2021. Now, you could say that's all a lie, and she just doesn't even know better. But SOEs are set up to hire when they're supposed to and retain workers when they're supposed to. And we've never, youth unemployment. When has youth unemployment ever threatened the CCP? So I don't think there's a serious problem to defend against in terms of CCP threat. And he also has an offensive strategy, which is do better, or at least as well, in strategic sectors using state direction at home, data control, and subsidies for key roles in global supply chains. So he's looking for either we hold our position in global supply chains, or, and this is explicit, we improve our relative leverage. People have less leverage over us. We have more leverage over them. He said that repeatedly in different ways. You can gain as a firm or a country if you deal with China, as long as you don't, obviously interfere with party control. That's an old one. As long as you don't interfere with the program of increasing relative Chinese leverage. So we just can't, New York especially, Wall Street just cannot get off the fact that he must want to expand wealth. But he's been in his party office for 12 years. Like, do you think he's just kidding? Oh, he wakes up one morning and goes, man, I've been screwing up. No, we know the idea that he doesn't really care that much about wealth, which is a very command economy approach. He cares about production. And they have a reasonable approach to production in the face of a declining labor force, which is we can't control the supply chain from start to finish. But we can make ourselves indispensable within the supply chain, and we will have more economic influence over you, and you will have less economic influence over us. So I would argue China's trajectory is obviously downward. Xi Jinping's response might be, and I'm about to be done, it'll be obviously downward after I'm dead. Like in 2050, whatever, I don't care. Not now, what you're focused on, wealth, prosperity, I don't want that to be bad, but it's not my priority. And in what I want, the strategic leverage that China has over the world and vice versa, we're doing fine. Better than fine, Ron might say. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Derek. Robert.
All right. Derek, hopefully we can match that debate we had in Brookings where people were afraid we were going to throw chairs. So, look, there's two questions. There's the question that sort of the economics class in Washington is just totally preoccupied with, which is macroeconomic forces, interest rates, capital, GDP, labor force. That's one question, and I'll address that. The second question, which is way more important for the U.S., is not that. It's advanced industry, technology capabilities, to the extent China gains and we lose. People were scoffing at Putin and the war because, oh, look, their GDP is smaller than the Italians or whatever. Yeah, because they don't have tourism. They're not really big on banking. Their GDP is based on minerals, steel, jet fighter planes. You don't fight wars with insurance companies and retail. Okay, just don't do that. So at one level, who cares about GDP? It's not the thing that we have to worry about. If China GDP grows, so what if it doesn't? But more importantly, Derek, I will be happy to have a bet with you over the next 10 years. Is Chinese GDP greater or lesser than the U.S.? I will say it'll definitely be greater, because Chinese productivity has been growing twice as fast as the U.S., even in the slowdown, and will continue to grow twice as fast for a long, long time, because China is playing catch-up. When you're playing catch-up, it is so much easier to grow productivity because you just copy what everybody else is doing. We're at the lead. When you're at the lead, it's really hard to keep productivity going. Derek mentioned Japan. I'm trying to say more about it because that's sort of like the basket case everybody uses. Oh, look at those Japanese men. What a bunch of suckers. We kicked their you-know-what. Really? Well, the main reason we kicked their you-know-what was the Plaza Accord, where we completely drove down the value of the dollar vis-a-vis the yen, and that was a good weapon to use. But more importantly, there's a new study just came out a couple days ago. Japanese productivity has been equal to U.S. productivity growth for the last 25 years. And that's what matters. And there's no reason I see on the horizon that Chinese productivity growth won't exceed ours for a long, long time. You look at what they're doing. They have completely automated ports. And look what happened when we had the stock workers strike in LA. The idea that we could even add a machine to that port was seen as anathema to not just the union, which I get, that's their job, to resist change, but to the elites in the U.S. Oh yeah, we can't have any workers lose their jobs. Xi Jinping does not care about workers losing their job. Doesn't care. They have a cruise missile factory that is almost 100% automated with robots. They installed 52% of all industrial robots last year, 2-3 years ago, in the world were installed in China. So yeah, their population's going to decline, and from 1.3 billion to 1.2 billion in 30 or 40 years. Well, that's going to make it easier to beat them in Taiwan because they have 100 million fewer people. So, and then the other thing I really worry about with this is like there's so many people, and I won't put you in that category, Derek, because I have respect for you, who have taken the business cycle problem in China as a way to, we don't have to worry about China anymore. Can't we get back to that free trade thing we used to have? Can't we get back to that? Because China's no longer a threat because they have a business cycle downturn. Yeah, they have a business cycle downturn, and maybe they're not managing it well, but it is that. It is a business cycle downturn that will change. It will get back to relatively full employment, and they will start growing again. I have no doubts about that. And so, I don't think wealth is declining. What you think of wealth as, which is a mistake Americans make, is wealth is in the stock market or in the housing. Housing prices go down, your wealth went down. No, you didn't. No, your house is still there. It is the same house you had before. The only difference is that the person who's buying it, their wealth increased. The person who's selling it, their wealth went down. So the notion that their wealth is going down, there's no evidence of that because GDP and per capita GDP in China is up. Okay, leaving that all aside, because I just don't agree, I think Chinese GDP will exceed ours fairly soon because they're
Utterly disagree. So we could spend, I said, and just to clarify, I utterly disagree with that, but go ahead.
Yeah. That's why we have to have a bet.
Right.
The real issue is not that. It's advanced tech. Let's just say hypothetically the GDP declines by 10%, which is, by the way, never, ever happened to a country that had a legitimate government in history. Never, ever happened. You can see it in stateless, in rogue states. It's never happened in history. But let's leave that aside, because the real issue is advanced technology. Wars are fought on advanced technology. National power comes from advanced technology. We were asked by the Smith-Richardson Foundation about 2 years ago to do a major study trying to assess how innovative Chinese firms are in China. And we looked at 10 major industries, including chemicals, robotics, EVs, biotechnology, computer chips, nuclear power, etc. And what we found is that in 2 of those, the Chinese are at global leadership, EVs and nuclear power. They're building more nuclear power plants than the rest of the world combined. And in most of the other areas, they are making incredible progress. So let's look at chemicals, an industry that nobody cares about, but is actually critical. If the West loses chemical production capability, we're screwed. The Chinese now dominate what are called bulk chemicals. They have about 58% of the global output of bulk chemicals. Those are relatively easy to make. Where they're going now is growing to fine chemicals, which is what DuPont and Dow or Dow DuPont make, et cetera. And they're making incredible progress. They're spending enormous amounts of money. And by the way, if you want to open up a fine chemical plant there, you don't have any regulations. And by the way, the government gives you a boatload of money. I won't say you don't have any, but you have very, very few. Look at quantum computing. The Chinese government is spending more on quantum computing support than all the rest of the world's governments combined. So robots, I'll use an example there. They've committed to leading the world in humanoid robots. And who's their main competitor? Elon Musk. And I'm not saying that badly. Elon Musk guy's a genius, and look what he's doing. He has a humanoid robot. Their humanoid robots cost 5 times less. They're 80% as good. So I don't think you can, I agree, the last point I'll make, Xi Jinping doesn't care fundamentally about GDP growth. What Xi Jinping cares about is advanced technology dominance. Dominance. And look at Boeing. I mean, Boeing is now, for a lot of self-imposed errors, they've had a lot of rough times. I would bet within a few years, neither Boeing nor Airbus will sell a single aisle plane in China again, because Comac is just, the C919 is, you know that, Craig, going great guns. And they're selling Comacs in Southeast Asia. So take away Boeing single aisle sales in China and take away Airbus single aisle sales there, and you seriously reduce their revenue growth, which makes it harder for them to build the next 777 version they want to build or whatever plane they want to make. Do the same thing in semiconductors and memory. Micron, SK Hynix. When the memory chips price starts falling 40, 50% price decline because the Chinese are flooding memory, where are those companies going to make money to reinvest in R&D? So I don't really worry about Chinese GDP. It'll continue to grow. Doesn't matter. What I worry about is their capabilities in advanced industries, and that is only going to get worse unless we take serious action to improve our capabilities.
Thank you both for that. So it was remarks with a heavy focus on statistics, and as we all know, Chinese statistics are rarely trusted even by Chinese officials. So how do we have this conversation, or how do we muster facts on our side while at the same time correctly parsing or negating Chinese statistics?
Well, I generally don't use Chinese statistics, so I can. I've had two giant projects that create separate data from China's. One of them China Beige Book and one of them the investment tracker. The investment tracker not being particularly relevant here. There's a level of uncertainty, and we know when the uncertainty rises. The uncertainty rises when China's having problems. They lie more. And they define problems differently than us. They define problems as instability, not as what we would call conventional downturns. But I don't think it's that difficult to understand, at least if you spend a lot of time doing it, understand what China's doing. Like, you don't have to say, oh, I certainly believe the level of non-performing loans you guys are announcing in the banking system, and whenever there's a banking crisis, the level of non-performing loans goes down, because that may make sense. So I don't know that I think the statistics are the problem. I do think we have another source of uncertainty, which is how to take the macro trajectory, which Rob and I disagree on, but he's wrong, and compare it to the tech trajectory where we actually agree on, so therefore Rob is right, and say how do we fit these things together. I'll note that the GDP gap between China and the United States has widened in absolute terms in the last 10 years, just FYI. But more important than that, because we have some agreement on, like, that's not really what matters here, is what does the Chinese trend look like in things that matter more than aggregates? I mean, GDP is an accounting construct where you combine a bunch of stuff. And Rob is talking about catching up. Well, catch up almost always falls short. I mean, look at countries and their patterns of catching up. The middle income trap is like this very vaguely defined thing, and often presented incorrectly. But countries have a lot of difficulty actually catching up. They get close and they stall. And what determines it, and Rob has this right, is productivity growth. And this is hard to measure, but it's not hard to measure because of China. We have problems measuring productivity growth in this country too. It's hard to measure productivity growth, period. And there are lots of fights between China watchers on the econ side about what the productivity growth actually is. I will say that Chinese population decline is going to be faster than Rob implied, and you're running uphill when your population is actually declining. Your labor force has now been shrinking for 8 years. 20 million people dropped out of labor force last year. That's productivity growth you have to overcome. The U.S. can, of course, shoot itself in the foot if we're trying to compare us to the United States by blocking immigration and controlling our own labor force. My criticisms of China do not imply the U.S. is doing well. That's not supposed to be here. Fundamentally, and I'm going to stop here, where Rob and I disagree is not really about the GDP trajectory, even though I'd be happy to take his money. It's about, I think, and I believe this is a matter of faith, that you cannot get productivity growth to be sustained without competition and private property rights. You can get it in certain areas to rise quickly. You can mobilize state capital. You can steal other people's technology. You can prey on foreign markets. They're going to do all that. But ultimately, you need a properly competitive market, meaning market competition, not state-directed competition. And you need returns to your own ownership. So there's a lot of fluff here where we're disagreeing on stuff that isn't the core disagreement. The core disagreement is not really about China's macro trajectory. It's not really about whether China can hurt the United States, because I agree with Rob. I totally agree. It's about how far can they go with their economic model. They can hurt us a lot before they get to their limits. I'm not arguing that. I just don't think that they can get to that catch-up stage that Rob was talking about, because I think their model ultimately falls short.
So I want to pull us back from the economic into the political, and this conversation might have been radically different had we done it a week later. So we've talked a lot about...
Yeah.
Sure, I know. It's hard not to, please.
So I think that, look, There's a lot of mythology about the middle income trap and the idea that it's an iron law of economics, which is nonsense. There are some countries like Singapore that have escaped it. I think that's not the right question. The right question is, if you look at China, China ultimately has two things really. It's an Asian tiger that just has a lot more power and focus. So its model is quite similar to Korea. It's earlier Japan, Taiwan, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look at all of them, I mean, you look at Singapore, South Korean productivity, it was like this and now it's like that. I mean, it's still growing, but not really. Japan, same thing. It's sort of the same as ours. You don't need to catch up. If they can get to 60% of our per capita income, they're twice as big as we are. And I don't see any, I'm happy to say I don't think China will, I'm willing to say China will never catch up to us in productivity because our system is better. But if they can get to 60%, they're giant. And they're not going to stay at 23%.
So, thank you. Going back to the political here, because we are a week away from what seems to be a historic election, how different would both the long-term questions be under a Trump or Harris presidency, but also just very specifically, how high do both of you put the risk of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, either partial or full, over the next several years? And Derek, your snort might have indicated your answer, but
No, my answer is like, this is out of my league, the Taiwan part.
I have the same answer. I don't know. That's not my area. People tell me it's my happen, but I have no clue.
Do you want to take Harris versus Trump first? Okay.
So ultimately, I don't think there's anything we can do to change the trajectory of China internally, or really fundamentally change their policy. We can throw some sand in the gears, but if you look at what we've done with semiconductor export controls, yeah, slows them down, but doesn't seem to really, the new. Again, can you believe it? Anyway, they say they have a new ASML-like, semiconductor machine. Maybe they do. So I don't know that there's a lot we can do. Even the Trump tariffs, I don't think would do very much. They would help a little bit in some ways, but I think at the end of the day, there'll be retaliation and currency. So I don't know that it matters. I think the biggest thing we can do are two things. One is, everybody says industrial policy is back. No, we never even had it, okay? CHIPS was defense, IRA was energy, infrastructure was jobs. We don't have a coherent, sector-based advanced technology strategy in the U.S. It's backed up by real money. We don't have that. Are we going to get it from Trump? No. Are we going to get it from Harris? No. You're just going to get something different. And then secondly, I think what we need to do is we need to have a serious effort among our allies to block Chinese imports that are made systemically unfairly. Europeans are beginning to sort of move in that direction, but I would never allow a COMAC plane to be bought by an American airline. They're not going to do it for a long time, but using that as an example, COMAC is an illegitimate company. It would not exist without forced tech transfer. It would not exist without massive subsidies. Now, Haier, which makes refrigerators, as far as I know, they seem like a legitimate company that don't get a lot of subsidies. Fine, but many of these Chinese companies are just not legitimate. They don't play by the rules, and I would block their influence. I think that's what we need to do. And that would slow them down significantly in terms of their capabilities to gain market share and hurt us at the same time, because that's the flip side of the coin.
Yeah, I mean, we started off, and we do have a fundamental point of disagreement, but now we're in the points of agreement. I was one of the first people to start advocating for decoupling and partial decoupling, because same thing. I don't really care if Haier sells a bunch of stuff here. And you can't imagine the response of Republican politicians. This is great. This is fantastic. I'm going to write legislation. Have you noticed an important piece of China legislation coming out of the Republican-controlled House in the last 2 years? No. So there's supposedly a bipartisan consensus on China. The bipartisan consensus on China is to talk a lot about China and how tough we need to be and to do almost nothing. And I agree with Rob to the extent of the U.S. can affect China with serious, costly action, costly for us too, and we don't want to take it. So we're just going to talk, and that isn't really going to matter. So I do not mean to minimize this election. I have very strong views about the election, but I don't think on China. So, people ask me about China, Harris does not want to work on China from the outset. She'll probably be forced to at some point, but it's not like coming out of the gate on China. And if Trump goes with a 60-20 tariff, all you're doing is incentivizing the Chinese to transship for the 20% tariff instead of the 60% tariff. So you're going to get more transshipment. So I have not seen a proposal that got any traction in either party that does anything. I don't want to pick on the parties too much, but we just had yesterday the Treasury Department say, "Oh, we finalized," in quotes. I love the press. We finalized an EO a week before an election in which our candidate is not running. The EO has a lifespan. It's supposed to be implemented January 2nd. It has a lifespan of 3 weeks. They finalized it. That was done deliberately. The EO could have been written in 2021. So the Democrats have not been serious in the White House. During the Trump administration, U.S. portfolio investment holdings of Chinese stocks and bonds soared in completely unprecedented fashion. They were not serious. I don't think the next Trump administration will be serious. I don't think a Harris administration will be serious. So it's a really important election, for democracy in the United States. It doesn't matter for U.S. China policy, unfortunately.
I think Trump's going to be serious. I just don't think he's going to do what's most effective. And I agree with, I don't think Harris, I think she was quoted saying that the Middle East is a bigger challenge than China.
That's what Phil Gordon thinks.
So that tells you a lot. And I think Trump will focus a lot on China. It's just a question of how effective it will be.
Interesting. Yeah. Back to China and Taiwan, because I do want to both give you credit for admitting that no one has any idea what Xi Jinping is thinking. That is basically impossible to know besides some graspings. That said, as we all know, a Chinese invasion would play some fun havoc on any economic model that we're creating or discussing there. I have a question on U.S. policies toward, you mentioned COMAC, U.S. policy towards U.S. companies and Chinese SOEs. I want folks in the audience to start thinking of questions. We'll be turning to the audience pretty soon. A quick note on questions. We here define questions as a short statement followed by a question mark, and we will be enforcing that. So have a think for your nice, tight questions. So U.S. policy, SOEs. So you mentioned COMAC. There's many very large U.S. companies that have deep partnerships with Chinese SOEs. As you know, SOEs, state-owned enterprises, are arms of the party and part of the same organization as the People's Liberation Army and the Ministry of State Security. What kind of policies, what kind of actions would you like to see, not just towards COMAC, but say towards U.S. companies that have joint ventures with companies like COMAC?
So you have to differentiate between strategically important sectors that are SOEs and ones that aren't. So I visited some gigantic, gas utility company or something like that, which was great, by the way. Quick start. I was doing this Obama U.S.-China experts group. We're over there. We're visiting like the number 2 guy in this big giant building. And we're waiting in the lobby to get ushered up. And they have a timeline of the company. Blah, blah, blah. And the first part of the timeline was 1849 when Marx wrote whatever he wrote. The second was 1917 with Lenin. The third was 1932 with Stalin, 49 with Mao, and then the company. Which I thought was fascinating. So I don't think we need to decouple. Maybe Derek and I might disagree on that one. I'm happy to sell the Chinese a lot of computer chips. I think it was a huge mistake for the administration to not allow Qualcomm and Intel to sell chips to Huawei. What planet are we living on? Huawei? They're not a national security threat. So I'm happy to sell them stuff, with some exceptions. But I don't think we should just assume because they're talking about military-civil fusion that everything we sell them goes into their military. If we don't sell them stuff, we lose the revenue. The Chinese gain the revenue, or the Japanese, or whatever. So I think we have to be a lot more strategic. I do think where there's promise is limiting joint ventures. But I think it has to be multilateral. If we keep doing our unilateral efforts to limit joint ventures, all we're doing is saying, hey, Japan, or Korea, you want that market? Go ahead. So I think if we could get Europe and the Asian leaders to agree with us on limiting joint ventures, I would be all for that. I just don't know that we can do it.
So I don't care much about the difference between SOEs and private firms. I did in the reform economy. when they were actually creating more space for private firms and shrinking the state sector, but they haven't been doing that for 20 years. Private firms can be told what to do by the Ministry of State Security just as easily as state firms. So I agree with Rob to an extent on strategic sectors, and I wrote a decoupling paper, a long decoupling guide for commercial staffers a month ago, or finished it a month ago, and the first step is you got to decide what's important to the United States on a durable basis. You can't decide it on the basis of an executive order by any administration because that is not durable. It has to pass the Congress, it has to have bipartisan support. Even if you don't get the sectors right, which you won't, you're not going to name the 10 most important sectors for the next 20 years. You're not going to do that. But if you're not doing this on a durable basis, you will not get the kind of US policy that actually matters. And in those sectors, that's where you decouple from the Chinese, right? Outside of that, it's an SOE, it's a private firm, in quotes. I don't care that much. So I would, I do think the burden on the U.S. government, which we have completely failed to meet, we have a bunch of lists of what sectors are important. It's not binding in law. It varies by administration. It varies by Congress. If we don't decide what's important in the competition, how do you win the competition? If you step on the basketball court and you're not sure, what gets you points, you're looking at the hoop and there's lines and you run and okay, you're not going to win. So we haven't decided what's important yet on a durable basis. That's what matters more than the state-private split.
So final question before I open up to the audience. This being a DC-China policy conversation, I'm contractually obligated to ask about AI. So what do we think about AI as, you talked about defining the competition, how important is AI and how are the US and China doing on the various scorecards?
So I'm going to defer largely to Rob. If he wants to make an argument, so when I started saying that China's economy was weakening due to their financial policies, especially at the time now due to demography, I said, if there's some sort of technological breakthrough to transform everything, because this is when the China bulls were actually willing to speak up. Now they're all quiet. Technological breakthrough, then fine. I don't know what that is. Now maybe that's AI, and I'm not qualified to evaluate that. So if you think there's a technology related to AI, related to quantum information science, whatever it is, related to synthetic biology, it doesn't have to be on the computational side, that you think is transformational, okay, well, that changes U.S. policy, and it changes our view of how U.S. is competing and China's competing. Because if we're winning on everything but this transformational technology, and they're winning on the transformational technology, suddenly the scales get a lot more balanced. I just don't know how to evaluate that. So, Rob?
So my colleague Hosen Omar, of those studies that Smith Richardson asked to do, we did a very deep dive into Chinese capabilities in AI. It's on our website. I encourage you to look at it. And the basic answer is we still are in the lead. We might not be after Judge Maida gets through with his breakup of Google, given that Google is the largest AI funder in the universe, way more than the Chinese are. But we're still in the lead. But we're largely in the lead. Our lead is really good in large language models. I'm not sure that actually is the most important part of AI. If you look at where the Chinese are doing AI well, they're doing it in applied areas. So they have this port that's super AI, they have an AI-enabled mind. They're really doing, rather than sort of this big thing so I can write my term paper in college, they're really doing it in an application area. And we have to be better at that. And the problem I see in the US is the fact that we can award a Nobel Prize to two economists who I've debated both, who say that we need to worry about AI getting rid of jobs. Chinese don't worry about AI getting rid of jobs, as long as we have that. So I think China could actually significantly go ahead of us in that area of sort of just applying AI in these sort of non-LLM ways.
Thank you. Questions? Please.
Yes, David Abramson, State Department. A mid-level Chinese businessman was quoted as saying, this is with respect to Russia, their relationship with Russia. Why are we letting a second-rate European country drag us down? So my question to you is China backing the wrong horse in the long run in supporting Russia? And I'm just wondering, looking at in the longer term, not just the short term, what your responses are to that, given their concerns about their other interests and how they're having to, increasingly, it's difficult for them to balance them with concerns about sanctions, et cetera.
Can I add to that question?
Please, Robert.
2025 is likely to be a reckoning year for the Russian economy. And their Keynesian, military Keynesianism is reaching its limits. And so I would add to the question, how much is China prepared to bail them out? Because I'm not sure they are.
So I can only answer the econ side of this, not the political or the military side of it. The Chinese backed both sides in the Sudanese civil war. They don't have a problem being on one side and flipping to the other side when it's convenient. The Russians are the premier supplier of global commodities across the board because they don't use them that well at home, because they're have great endowments in not just energy but also metals and food. The Chinese are not going to cut the Russians off, because if you look at Chinese external economic policy, I mean, since 2002, it's been focused on diversification of commodity supply to feed the industrial machine. So they're not going to cut the Russians off. If somebody says, oh, the Russians are protecting our commodity supply from Russia is costing us too much with A, B, C, D, E, then they'll just shift a little bit to make A, B, C, D, E happy. And the oil is Middle East, obviously, but metals come from a variety of sources: South America, Sub-Saharan Africa. The food, the Russians are important as an alternative to food because the rest of food is controlled by the Anglo-Saxon countries, essentially. So the econ side of this is they're going to try to keep the Russians as friendly, large-scale commodity suppliers, because losing Russia as a commodity supplier is a really bad thing, and they don't want to do that. In terms of supporting the Russian economy, because the Russian economy is small, and because the Chinese are sitting on a bunch of foreign exchange reserves that they had some problems in 2014, 2015. They've stabilized those problems. They have a lot of money sitting around doing nothing, and that money can be lent to Russia. Now, if there are sanctions that affect the Chinese, that's a factor to reckon with. But blowing $250 billion on supporting the Russians per year, they blew that on the Belt and Road already, and that had less concrete returns than helping the Russians would. As long as China is export competitive, and there's been no sign of weakening in their export competitiveness, they are going to bring in a lot of money through trade. Yes, there's capital flight. The trade money is larger than coming in is larger than the capital leaving to date. So they're going to have a lot of money available to support the Russians if that's what they want to do. The military side of this, what to mean North Korean troops in Russia if they're North Koreans, I don't know how to evaluate this. Russia has a lot of value to China as a commodities diversified to commodity supplier, and they're going to spend money on that. That's what they've spent money on externally, including the Belt and Road, the entire time they've engaged with the global economy in terms of capital.
So I agree with most of that. I think China is the equivalent of a divorced dad who never sees his son, and every time he sees him, he buys him a new Xbox. They just want to buy friends, and the money is meaningless. And how have we hurt China in response to their alignment with Russia? And the answer is we haven't. So it's just money to them. They got a lot of it, and they're more than willing to spend it. I think the other thing, again, this starts to go away from my area of expertise. I'll admit that readily. And it seems pretty clear that China's goal is to be the global hegemon, replace us, be it. They need friends. Russia's a really good friend to be able to do that sort of younger brother alliance. So that makes perfect strategic sense to me that they would do that.
I think also if Trump wins, there might be the idea that we can peel Russia away from China, and we can peel Putin away from Xi Jinping. Whether or not that's successful, who knows? But we might see more policy direction in that area. Please.
Craig Allen, U.S. China Business Council. I have a question mostly for Derek, I think. PNTR. It's in the revocation of PNTR is in the Republican platform. I think it's much more likely than it's ever been before. What would be the economic consequences, both on the United States and on China? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question. I do think it's possible that you could see it build up in the Republican Party where it gets hard to get in the way of PNTR if they have.
I'm sorry, can you define what that is for the audience?
That's the, if you've heard of MFN, PNTR, we, for some idiotic reason, changed the name. And that's basically, we granted China that as part of WTO accession. And they go together, right? You can ignore the WTO and you can ignore PNTR, and we have. We've done things that are not WTO compliant if the WTO were actually a functioning organization, which it's not, and that violate PNTR. But so one option is we just do whatever the hell we want. We leave PNTR as it is. If you formally reject PNTR, the answer to Craig's question depends on, well, what are you reverting to? We don't even have, are we going back to the 2001 tariff lines before China's WTO accession? A lot of key products that Rob and I would agree on are like, well, this is really important in U.S.-China trade, didn't exist to have tariff lines in 2001. So, are we going to default back to U.S. tariffs in 2001, which were actually low? Or are we going to default to now we can do anything we want? So it's almost, people write studies on this, and I'm always like, the studies are rigged by what you think the change is. You may know this, and you may have done the same thing. There's been engagement with members of Congress, not so much the Trump campaign because they're afraid to say anything that of any substance. Doing serious work on what a new tariff schedule would look like. And guess what? You get people saying, not this one, we make this in my district. And when you aggregate that, it turns out there's a lot of exceptions to what could potentially be high tariffs. That would happen on a 50 or 60% tariff regime on China as well. So my answer to you is, I don't think it would make very much difference, but not because it couldn't. It certainly could. It certainly could be very disruptive to U.S. trade. If you said PNTR is canceled as of July 1st, 2025, and we haven't worked out the details yet on what's going to replace it, the uncertainty would be disruptive. So there's the possibility for disruption. But when we've tried to work on it in detail, what we get is we're not going to move to a tariff schedule that is that disruptive. And so it would really have to be botched, where we just act like we don't know what's going to happen. And then the disruption would come from uncertainty rather than actual high trade barriers. So potentially, it's very disruptive. I don't think in practice, even though I think it's a live issue, it will be. Because when we've tried to construct an alternative, it's turned out that the same pressures are present as with the handing out exceptions to 25 or 50% tariffs.
I think it would also lead to more second sourcing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hey, thanks. Michael Soblik, American Foreign Policy Council. Question for Rob, and it's clarification, because I might have misheard you, but I wasn't sure. When you mentioned the administration limiting Qualcomm and Intel chips to Huawei, you said that was a good or a bad decision?
Bad.
For which reason?
Both of those companies, particularly Intel, need sales. We cut off our sales. We gave the Chinese sales for no serious national security benefit. Why would we want? Intel's struggling, and we're basically said, hey, you're going to have even less revenue now. That's why it's a bad thing. Why would we not? I don't know, Derek, you and I may differ on this point. It's an important point. I'm happy. I think we should be selling. I'd like Google to go back into China. The more we can sell the Chinese stuff that's not military stuff, the better off we are and the worse off they are. So I don't want to sell them a lot of stuff because we get the money, they don't.
The military links of Huawei, like the surveillance of telecom systems and friendly allied countries, what are your thoughts on those risks?
But we're not talking about high-end chips.
Well, even if we were talking about high-end chips, we've already addressed that problem. We have banned Huawei from our telecom system. So the problem is solved. It's just solved. The idea, this was a mistake that I think the Trump administration made, which was we wanted to kill Huawei. Well, you can't kill Huawei. It was impossible to do. It was just stupid. I get the thing, we want to keep them out of our networks. I'm fully in favor of that. But this has nothing to do with the security of them in our networks. It just has a question of are we selling them or not. And also, at the end of the day, it didn't deter them too much. They were able to get their own chips and keep moving forward. And so they spy on the Africans. They were going to do that no matter what, and there's nothing we can do about it.
I mean, the area of disagreement, well, there are multiple areas of disagreement, but I think the most interesting one I have is, I think Rob's model is not dynamic enough, meaning, yes, we would gain from that revenue, and then we would make Intel even more dependent on the Chinese, the way Boeing is now. And so we are setting up a situation where we will get more lobbying, more distortion. I hope nobody here, I actually know somebody from NVIDIA pretty well, and I like her a lot, so I hope nobody else is here from NVIDIA, but like NVIDIA's behavior in the last couple of years has been really questionable. from my standpoint, and it's because they're correctly defending their interests, but it's not the national interest. So I do see a downside. I take Rob's point. The revenue is helpful. It's our revenue. There's a gain. I see a downside where you have American companies that are too dependent on China and have been, I once told the then chairman of Boeing that no, I didn't want Boeing's bringing Americans and Chinese together, across the Pacific. And he looked at me like I was insane, but everyone wants that. I'm like, no, not everyone does, because you come to Washington and you threaten a bunch of American legislators. And so I think there's a long-term downside that isn't appreciated if you get to the point that these companies become dependent. And even very large American companies, because the Chinese market is so large, have exhibited signs of dependence and the associated political behavior in the U.S.
So I do gotta say, that's a great idea, 100% support that. We'll just get rid of Boeing, we'll get rid of Intel.
Just limit their dependence on China.
And their lobbying, NVIDIA's lobbying shop will shrink. I mean, this will be a friggin' nirvana. Congress can then protect what we've died. Come on, Derek. I mean, come on. Look.
Hey, Rob, you are a classic mercantilist. We should sell as much to the Chinese and not buy stuff. First of all, that's impractical in the world. They're not going to go along with it. But
of course they are.
Of
course they are. Of course, Intel.
Mercantilists always get along.
They
One mercantilist country, China. We become a mercantilist country. It'll work.
They wanted to buy Intel chips. We were the ones that said you can't buy Intel chips. Of course. Now, do they want to do that forever? Of course not. Their goal, finish.
Okay.
Their goal is self-sufficiency. I get that. But 10 more years of Boeing sales, 10 more years of Intel sales, that's critical. It slows them down. It doesn't slow us down, helps us speed up. So, yeah, and by the way, I am a mercantilist in the sense of, no, I'm really serious.
No, I know.
Because I cannot stand this sort of like neoclassical Adam Smith stuff. We have a $1 trillion trade deficit. We have to pay that. My kids and your kids will pay that. No doubt about it, and we'll pay it with a radically reduced value of the dollar, and we'll all be importing $50,000 less a year. So yes, I'm a mercantilist. I'm a mercantilist also, as we talked about Adam Smith saying. Adam Smith didn't want to sell cannons to the French. So I want to do everything possible to have a strong, advanced industry, dual-use industrial base. Call me a mercantilist. Yes, that's what I'm
going to let Elnagar jump in there. Elnagar, please.
I will continue this conversation, actually. Elnagar Altiver, covered China in Senate and South Committee. I would be curious about your view. I respect both of you and thank you for your insights. You both agreed on controlling some strategic sectors, so I'm trying to find some common points as well. But before I ask that, I was wondering your view, Robert, on Derek's point about what is your strategy? So we keep selling, we keep giving them the chips, the technology and everything. Military fusion is real. It is helping their military, and not to mention the human rights abuse and all the other problems that comes with it. So we keep bolstering them, we keep helping them develop, we keep our dependence on them, we keep creating those lobbyists that come to Congress every day, every time, and Derek is absolutely right. There has been no China bill in the last 3 years because every time we try to do something, there is a series of lobbyists at our door basically arguing against it, and these are the NVIDIAs and the Intels and others. So what is our strategy to outcompete China, to prevent them from displacing us, to prevent them from becoming the military, economic, and political superpower displacing the United States if we continue selling them everything?
So this is something I am critical of the current administration on, is everything, the excuse of doing everything is on military. And the problem with that, first of all, is you then don't open it up to the broader issue of, I wouldn't allow certain companies in here. Not, like, for example, I would have opposed Lexmark printer company was being bought by a Chinese company, a state-owned or state-backed company, got $4 billion from the big fund. It was told in a memo, you go out and buy a global printer company. They bought Lexmark for 40% price premium. They had stolen Lexmark technology, and CFIUS said, who the hell cares? That's because we have this narrow national defense aperture. So number one, I don't think we should use national defense as the aperture or the reason. We should use unfair advantages in advanced industries. But secondly, what have we done? First of all, weapons don't use 3 nanometer chips. Weapons use 50 nanometer chips. Missiles don't use 3 nanometer chips. They don't use cutting edge chips. So cutting them off from ships isn't really directly related to their military
What about
capabilities.
super soldiers?
What it's, pardon?
Precision guided munitions, super soldiers, like the really high tech stuff.
No, I was about to say that. So, but it's not related to things like we think about. If we cut off their chips, they're not going to be able to have a guided missile attack one of our aircraft carriers. No, that's wrong. First of all, they can do that. They can make those chips right now, and there's nothing we can do that will stop them from doing that. So the issue is really much more about what do they get from 3 nanometer, 2 nanometer, or 5 nanometer chips, and yeah, they get something. I don't deny that, but the idea that somehow we're going to be able to make a big enough dent, I wouldn't sell them. I don't know, like things that they could make nuclear bombs on. I get that, but most of this other stuff, it's so completely dual use that we end up hurting ourselves. Now, if we were the hegemon, which we used to be, I mean, that's the other thing I think the problem in the U.S. is we still think of ourselves as we were in the 70s and 80s, where you might have Toshiba that's cheating a little bit here, but we had such power. We controlled so much of the global technology chain that we could cut people off and really make them suffer. Those days are gone. We can't do that anymore. And as long as our allies are taking advantage of that, which they are, what do we get from it? And then secondly, I don't think you can underestimate the speed at which China is working to get around that. So if we take their sales, we slow them down.
So we'll add one point to that. We study corporate exposure to China, and one of the most fascinating things is that the companies that tend to be more exposed to China aren't the most successful companies in China. And so, your Googles of the world, or companies that are trying to sell into the Chinese market, often is a bad financial decision for them. It's just there's been this narrative for so long that you have to be in China. Whereas for a lot of companies, it's the wrong financial decision, leaving aside the massive political implications. This side of the room. Yes, please.
I'd like you to indulge a longer-term trajectory, because trajectories have a longer term. In 1914, the U.S. had reached a critical threshold in what you might call world power. That's 30% of the world's manufacturing. There were also many other advantages in technology and in the capacity for very rapid war mobilization, as well as a well-educated and mobilizable population. And in spite of the U.S. having grown so much economically, it has arguably declined in all of the factors that make for a balanced definition of world power. So I would like to ask you whether or not, and since we don't have many historical examples, whether or not you think that either China or the United States can continue to develop, and in the case of the U.S. it would be a renewal rather than a continuance of its power, in the face of long-term population decline. And this is looking, again, I started with a century, so if you would look ahead a century, how would you address that? How would you think about that?
Well, I talked a lot about demography. If we look ahead at, you can look 2 generations ahead now. So you can look, if you define a generation, you can look roughly 50 years ahead now, because you know the base in which people are going to be having children. And in 50 years, the Chinese population will probably be, I want to be conservative here, 350 million people less than it is now. Maybe that's 55 years. Maybe I'm cheating on the generation size. I think that's completely incongruous with world leadership. I think it's impossible. I think China's society is going to fundamentally change. Now, if someone wants to say, Derek, you're saying China's society is going to fundamentally change in 2070, and I think it's 2080. We can argue about this. There are arguments about the true size of China's population now and the population pyramid in the elderly, because the Chinese smoothed their population statistics, most recently due to COVID, but really for a long time. But when you're talking about the long-term trajectory you're talking about, so let's say 2114, 200 years after the 1914 start, it's not compatible with China being a global power. The country just will have shrunk too much. Now, the U.S. has a version of that. It is not as extreme, but we had a version of that as well. We have fought off the demographic problems that are now, that destroyed Europe as the European global powers, destroyed the Russians, destroy the Japanese as a potential global power. We've done it primarily through immigration. If we turn away from immigration and I am not saying everyone should be able to come over the border. I study East Asia. I actually get really offended that people who live on a contiguous landline get preferences in immigration, and people who have to go across the ocean don't get preferences. That doesn't make any sense. I also find it morally offensive. So I'm not taking a position on contemporary immigration policy issues specifically. But if we don't invite immigration, then we face a version that the Chinese face. And then the argument is, well, China is aging and their population is shrinking and ours will still grow for a while before we have the same problem, even though we're aging. So like we'll be ahead of them for a while before we both reach the same outcome.
Well, when populations, shrinking populations shed their older generation, they're free of a burden, as you could argue. We don't have the experience yet.
Right.
And you shed them all at once, very old people. You should, frankly, be in a position where you can be leaner and more efficient.
Well, so yes. So at some point, the Chinese demographic will turn back up. That's probably 75 years from now. Again, we're using 3 generations from now. And then the question is, what's the population base when they turn back up, right? And the UN, which has been dragged kicking and screaming to this projection, says the 2100 population in China, 2100, 700 million people. And I just find that decline, not in the next 10 years, but in the next 50 years, to be incompatible with the kind of global leadership you're talking about. That does not mean the U.S. automatically is the global leader.
Yeah, first of all, who cares? We're going to fight a war with China, and this or not, this will all be decided in the next 30 or 40 years, and then after that, we'll see something else. There is democratic theory suggests when you get to a certain per capita income point, you switch over to be a democracy, which is what Korea did, Japan, Taiwan. So at some point, you could argue that the people in Shanghai are already fed up with Xi Jinping, and then they'll turn into democracies. At some point, growth solves the problem. The question is, do they take over the world before they get to that point? Secondly, to Derek's point, let's just say they get down to 600 billion people. That's 600 million. That's 250 million more than we have. And let's just say their per capita income growth grows to 65%. They're still way bigger than we are. So I just don't think that is the right question. I think real answer to the question, who's going to lead in 21, 24, and that's India. Seems obvious.
No way.
What is that?
No.
And
Well, I don't think either of you can do that.
We won't be around.
Yeah.
See, you have this thing about convergence, and there's just empirically most converging countries fail.
I'm not talking about
miserably.
You've heard me say I'm not talking about convergence. I'm talking about closing the gap.
Emily, please.
Oh, thank you both. So I'm a historian, not an economist, so I've been learning a lot from your all's discussion. I'll ask a slightly historically minded question, but one that I think is very relevant. So after Deng Xiaoping, political theorists, particularly after reform and opening up, opined that there was this implicit contract between the CCP and the Chinese people. We'll provide economic growth, and your standard of living will rise, and then in return you will stay out of politics. Now the thinking goes this contract is broken. What do you all think about this model? Do you think it's too simplistic? Do you think it matters what the Chinese people think about all this as it moves forward? Or should
Why is the contract broken? Everyone's going to have a job. The threat to the party from unemployment, the party was terrified of unemployment in the 90s and the 2000s. That threat is going away. The labor force is shrinking. Now you have a labor matching problem, which is completely different than millions of angry workers in the streets because they don't have a job. Per capita income will rise. That's the fun thing. You just keep your economy stable, which is all China wants. The population shrinks. Per capita income will rise. There's environmental cleanup.
I'm glad you agree with me, Derek. This is great.
So you guys think that the contract is not broken?
No, it's not broken. Look, the contract is broken. What we hear mostly here is Chinese elites who are pissed off that they're not as rich as they were 5 years ago. Okay? And they're not. But that's not the contract. The contract is, do you think your children's lives are going to be better than yours? Well, your children are going to more likely to have a job and less pollution. And is it rapid growth? But their incomes no, it's not rapid growth, but their incomes are going to be higher. If the contract is, I want China to be as rich as Japan, or I'm going to riot, okay, then it's broken.
So
that wasn't never the contract.
I think the contract is broken. I agree with you. And I think they've changed the contract. So for a long time it was, hey, you know, Chinese older people, my PhD office mate when I got my PhD was from China. Yeah, he used to tell me they used to eat dog. You'd go out in the countryside and kill some dogs and cook them up for dinner. Because he was out in the countryside in the Cultural Revolution, and he was dirt poor. They still remember that. I think the new contract is not about, you know, you're going to keep getting richer and richer. They'll get marginally richer. The new contract, I think, is China is going to regain its rightful place as the center of the universe, and we're going to lead the world. And he's going to rely on pride more than yuan. I think that's the new contract. And
So you think ideology matters?
I think national pride is what the issue is, and the Chinese love that stuff, in my view. And it's going to take them a long way, I think.
I'll just do a two-finger on that. I don't think the contract was ever about staying out of politics. I think the contract was about following politics and being proud of, or at least complacent towards the Communist Party. I think also, just a good general caveat for all these conversations, China is still a remarkably diverse place. And so we have to paint with a big brush here, but there is a lot of disagreements within China and a lot of different stories in China that we can't all tell here. We have, I think, about 5 minutes left, so we'll do a final question over here, and then both of you get to agree and make up. Concluding remarks.
we're not doing that.
Please.
Thank you, Han Kuyo, the Peterson Institute. The electric vehicle, when I look at this US and EU approach, kind of a subtle difference. Of course, they drop high the tariff, but basically US kind of shut off the even FDI into the US, but Europeans kind of welcome it because they know that they are the best technology. They need to catch up. So my question is that, are you worried about the U.S. kind of industrial competitiveness falling behind if U.S. continue to go to this path? And then, if so, what would be the sort of balanced approach that U.S. can address obviously legitimate national security concern, but not really hurting industrial competitiveness?
So are you? No, I'm not worried at all. I mean, by the way, if you look at the latest BEA numbers, which we've analyzed on the website, and this was true in 2002, so it probably has changed since all the investment incentives, but the share of greenfield FDI as a share of total FDI, which is acquisition, is the lowest it's been in 25 years. Almost all FDI in the U.S., 92% of FDI is acquisitions. At best, yeah, that can help somewhat if you got a weak America. Like I think the Japanese Nippon Steel acquisition would probably be a good FDI. It's not that big a deal. I don't agree with you on Europe. What's happening in Europe, if the European Union had CFIUS, which they don't, they would not allow these acquisitions. You look at the study we did on robotics, man. The Chinese have bought large numbers of European robot companies, particularly in Eastern Europe, to extract that technology. That's not helping them. That's buying their company. So the reason China can succeed in Europe is the divide and conquer strategy. Hungary is going to tell Brussels, go take a hike. Poland's going to tell them to go take a hike. They don't have enough power to basically do the kinds of things we do in our national interest. So I'm not worried about it. The other reason I'm not worried, as long as we stay open to good FDI from Korea, Germany, Canada, that's fine. But I don't want Chinese FDI in the U.S. by and large. I think it would be bad for us.
Quick answer on EVs. U.S. EV demand just isn't very big enough for us to care about. And it's not going to be big enough for us to care about. We're organized very differently than Europe. We have a very different auto industry. We have very different kinds of auto demand. So I wouldn't expect our policies in response to foreign EV production to be the same as European production. I mean, there's no reason to say, well, we should be like Europe on EVs. Our transportation industry is very different than Europe's.
So for closing remarks, Derek, I give you the opening, so you go first, and then we'll have Rob have the last word.
I don't know. I feel like I interrupt so much. I don't really have much in the way of closing remarks. Rob and I accused him of being a mercantilist. I wasn't accusing him of being a mercantilist like that. That's automatically always wrong. It's just that the Chinese are mercantilists. If the U.S. is mercantilist, the idea that they're going to say, oh yeah, we want to buy U.S. stuff when you won't buy our stuff isn't going to fly. And so I was just talking about a limit on his proposal of letting American firms sell. But there is a difference between us in that I do think growth comes from neoclassical foundations. I think it comes from land, labor, capital, and innovation. We have better land. The labor force, Rob keeps talking about the size of a labor force, that the labor force trend is in our favor. We're much richer, and their financial system is a total mess, which is why the renminbi is not convertible, because they can't open it up because all the money would leave. And so that leaves innovation, and innovation is the hardest thing to fight over, and that's why I'd like to say Rob and I don't loudly disagree. In fact, I think we more agree than disagree on the innovation threat from China. But I do think, and Rob sort of hinted at his disagreement with us before, who cares about what happens X decades from now? That's fair. I think we know the long-term trajectory of China. The long-term trajectory of China economically is downward. It's unavoidably downward. When and what's going to happen to the U.S. in the interim, I think, are much, more interesting questions. And so, these bets that Rob will die first before me, of course, but these bets that Rob and I have about the long term aren't going to pay off because we're not going to be around to collect them. I'm extremely confident about the long term, but I'm also, that doesn't mean I disagree with Rob about the short term. I think in the short term, we face a serious threat from the Chinese. We face a political threat, a security threat, and an economic threat, and it is focused on advanced sectors. So I'm I'm doing the stupid econ thing where I say on the one hand, on the other hand. If you just ask me about China's economic trajectory, I have an absolutely clear answer. We're just arguing about when we no longer think of China as a candidate for global leadership. But if you ask me about what's it going to be like getting there, it's going to be rough for the U.S. and we're not ready.
So, minor point, and then I'll wrap up. Look, if the Chinese don't want to buy our stuff, that's their problem. I just don't want the U.S. government telling them that. It's like, if Google doesn't want to go there, that's their business. I don't care. I don't want the U.S. government to say, Google, you can't go there. If Intel says, oh, geez, they're not buying our chips anymore, fine. But I don't want the government to stop legitimate commercial sales to China that just hurt us. I think this boils down to ultimately sort of how you conceive economics. I coined this term, what we need are producerists as opposed to the economics class, which are largely marketists. Economists think about markets and prices and all that. Who cares? That's table stakes. Yes, you can't raise interest rates to 400%. Yeah, you can't destroy growth, of course, but we don't do that anymore. We need to think about it as producerists. In other words, how are our producers functioning? And if they're not functioning well, that's a problem. And so that's why I don't care too much about GDP growth. There are these libertarians, like Iglesias, who's like, why don't we just import 1 billion people? What a great idea that would be. And you think driving to New York on Memorial Day weekend is bad? It's just crazy. So if we imported 1 billion people, I think our GDP would go up. It's not the point. By this standard, Luxembourg is a ghetto because they only have 800,000 people. No, their per capita income is way higher than ours. So I think fundamentally we need to care about per capita income and advanced industry capabilities. And on that point, Derek, our capital investment rates are quite low. They're really low compared to the Chinese. So, and you hear the narrative. The fact that 2 Nobel Prize winning economists, who I've debated, say things like, we should slow down AI, we should put a tax on robots. Are you out of your mind? You want to put a tax on robots to slow down U.S. productivity growth when the Chinese not only don't put a tax on robots, but there are provinces in China that are putting $1 billion into robot adoption. So this all avoided another problem. Another thing we could have debated is, we're really asleep here at the switch. We really aren't. We don't fundamentally care about this issue. We take these palliatives, like let's block a few chip exports to China, and then we go, oh, look at that, we've done our job. So are we going to get serious with either administration? No. Maybe in 2028 we might get serious, but we're not serious now.
I agree with that, and Al Nagar would agree too.
Thank you to our hosts and to our wonderful panelists.